Welcome to the San Diego Psychological Association's podcast, Diving into Healing. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Carcel. This podcast has been developed with the intent to inform and educate the general public and providers and should not be relied upon for any other purpose. The content, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and not those of the San Diego Psychological Association. On today's show, we are talking about EMDR and little and big trauma. Our guest today is Alexandra Brown, who is the founder of Thrive in Life Therapy. She created this group practice with a focus on fully integrating mental health with physical fitness and movement. Alexandra believes in using trauma-informed care to heal individuals, their families, and communities. She focuses on both the top-down approach to therapy as well as the bottom-up approach to focus on the mind-body connection. Welcome, Alexandra, and thank you for being on the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so happy to have you. I'm actually really happy to talk about this topic because we've talked about trauma in the past and we've discussed it in depth of, trauma responses and what is trauma. And I think it's really good to do a little recap, but more importantly, EMDR has been a form of treatment that has been floated around to clinicians, practitioners, and also clients and patients. And, I think it's one of those things, though, that there's not a lot of information. So I'm glad that you're here to clarify. And I thought we could start with, just a basic overview on what is trauma.
Yeah, I love it. So I think that it is kind of becoming more common and more people are talking about trauma. I think a lot of people have different definitions and maybe even some misunderstandings. I think typically when people think about trauma, they think about the event, right? They think about this huge thing that has to happen to them. And that's kind of what is known. So when people say, oh, have you endured trauma? They're like, yeah, I have, or no, I haven't. Like nothing serious, nothing major, nothing big has really happened to me in my life. And when I see clients and they have some symptoms of anxiety, depression, and tell me that they've never experienced anything major in life, well, then I kind of connect back to a more broad definition of trauma. And really, I would let them know that trauma is more than the event that happens, right? It cannot be measured just by the event alone. It's an experience. So trauma is anything that happens too fast, too soon, is too much for our nervous system to handle. It happens too long or too little for too long. When we think about child abuse, neglect, abandonment, that type of thing, like that happens, they didn't receive what they needed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. I think those are great examples of, real world trauma experiences. And, on the show, we've talked about big T trauma and little T trauma. I'm glad that you brought up, how people approach it because, most people think of big T trauma, like the major things that happen to us, like devastating events, catastrophic events, rape, incest, very traumatic things, right? PTSD, thinking of veterans coming back from war, witnessing atrocities and things that no one really should ever see. But, there's also little T traumas, and those tend to be very minimized. A lot of times just microaggressions is an example, or, people experiencing, fear because they've had, incidences in their life where they've been, verbally or emotionally abused, but they minimize it like, oh, everybody goes through that. But trauma is basically anything that has changed our ability to function in an effective way to some degree or another. And that's really important because that helps us clarify that it's not just the big stuff. It's anything that's shaped us or changed us to be more hypervigilant or to engage in a way that we may not have had those things not happen to us. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Those things can't be undermined. And that's why, it's not objective. What is traumatic to one person, another person may not find that traumatic, right? So it's really just how our nervous system perceives and handles that experience. So it's anything that exceeds our ability to cope in the moment.
Exactly.
And that could look different for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. There's different levels of, and there's attachment that we can talk about. A person who has security and proper coping mechanisms in their upbringing can handle a trauma differently. A lot of people don't have that comfort and that privilege. So it's a reality where, it's not about a person's ability necessarily. It's about background. It's about what we've learned. And I think that really speaks a lot to, helping shape a person to cope. And I agree completely. I'm curious, when we talk about trauma too, do you have like a form of how you would categorize types of trauma?
I think there's actually a lot of types of trauma. So that could be acute trauma. That could be something that happens really suddenly. It could look like a single experience, like a car accident or a sex assault. There's chronic trauma that looks like an ongoing experience of traumatic events. That could look like child abuse or war, like you had mentioned, living in poverty. I talk about pre-verbal trauma because that kind of gets overlooked too sometimes. People may not be aware of that. That's like a developmental form of trauma. It happens in the earliest stages, like in utero, newborn phases, infancy, right? So that's could look like if a child or infant had to be in an incubator, right? And they didn't get that connection. They didn't have that skin to skin, that attachment. It could look like adoption, right? When you're like physically given up from that person that you were like, in utero with. It could look like a mom with anxiety or depression that could affect the newborn or the child. So yeah, anything really in the earliest stages of life. And then intergenerational trauma, right? Trauma that gets passed down generationally that we don't realize, but we pass down our nervous systems, right? We pass these things down. Sometimes that gets overlooked as well.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the pre-verbal. I hadn't considered that. That is a very important point. We think about trauma as being something that is more impacting in the sense of, adult consciousness, like or even younger adult, but verbal stumbling on that one. It actually matters equally, right? So there's just all of these different forms that are so important. I'm curious, what do you perceive as the impact of trauma on mental health and on personal development?
Oh, so many things, right? So many things. The impact is huge. Symptoms like anxiety, depression, panic attacks, any type of eating disorders, addictions, right? Because that's just how we cope, right? Maybe maladaptive, but we learn to cope with things that have happened. So there's no shame in that. That's what it is. We also talk about chronic pain, digestive issues, weight loss or weight gain can be an impact of trauma because it's connected through the vagus nerve and digestion. Difficulty managing emotions, hypervigilant all the time, or in infancy, childhood, if we didn't learn co-regulation, it's going to be very hard for us to self-regulate as adults. So we have to talk about the physiological changes in the brain as well. That's so important, right? If we're living in survival mode because of the impact of trauma, it's very difficult to integrate new information. Trauma takes away our ability to imagine, right? Our self-worth. So when we talk about that trauma responsive fawning, that could lead to people-pleasing behaviors, lack of boundaries, because that's stuff that we're taught. Perfectionism. So anything like that. So there's huge impacts, definitely.
Yes, there are so many things. This basically changes our ability to function, like I said before. And it's something that, we want to make sure that people get the most out of their treatment and, things that can help them function and get back to baseline in a way where they're able to cope with the trauma and have more resilience. So this is where EMDR comes in. So I'm so glad that you're here to talk about this because this particular modality has grown in popularity. This is definitely something that we're hearing more providers offer. And it's something, though, that a lot of people, because it's a newer form, it's not that new, but it's a newer form of treatment. It's something that people lack information on. So I thought we could segue for a second here and talk about what is EMDR.
Love it. Yes. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's an evidence-based practice, meaning that it's been researched, it has positive outcomes. I typically love using EMDR because I find that the results seem to be faster and you can use it for so many different things. So trauma, complex trauma, definitely. However, I've also used EMDR for anxiety, depression, disordered eating, addictions, phobias, nightmares, social anxiety. abandonment and neglect. I had a couple clients with narcissistic parents, and we've targeted that. So like so many options.
Can you tell us a little bit about the procedure? Like, how does this differ from other forms of treatment for trauma? So, for example, we have internal family systems, trauma focused CBT, trauma sensitive mindfulness. What is the difference between those modalities and interventions and EMDR?
Yeah, so EMDR, it's considered a bottom up approach, meaning that it's really somatic, and that's why it works so well. So, going back to the basic definition of trauma, right? It's not cognitive. So, if trauma is not cognitive, then we can't heal it just cognitively, right? So, I love EMDR because it incorporates some cognition, but also sensory, right? I'll ask the client to do a body scan, or where do you feel that in your body? That is one of the questions that's asked before we go into the reprocessing. So it's a very somatic approach. It involves emotions as well. So that's really important. It's like a full integration of this healing modality.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I really appreciate the somatic processing piece. It makes me think of Peter Levine and his work with trauma as well, which is so significant. So I can appreciate that. Apparently, there's 8 phases. So I'm not formally trained in EMDR, so this is actually great for me to learn too. There's 8 phases of EMDR. Can you explain those?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 8 phases of EMDR. Most of the time we think about phase 4, which is the reprocessing. And that's kind of where like the magic happens. And that's the part where everyone gets really excited about. But before we get to phase 4, there's phases 1, 2, and 3. So in phase 1, that's the history taking, and that's the treatment planning. So basically what I'm doing as the clinician, I am doing a full history. I'm thinking about past issues, present triggers, even future templates that we could work. We're mapping out a plan. We are creating a structured outline. I'm also listening to how my client tells a story. I'm listening for any type of disassociation, treatment goals, continuing to establish rapport is really important. I think attunement is so important in any therapeutic process. Step 1 is really important, as is step 2. So step 2 is resourcing. Resourcing is nothing that we rush into. It's nothing that we speed through to get to like the fun part. Resourcing is so important. It continues throughout all of the phases of EMDR because we may target something later and then find out that we needed a resource. So then we just add more resources to help the client stabilize. So this is really important. We want to prepare our clients to achieve stabilization for phase 4 in the reprocessing. And it also allows the client to access positive outcomes. So if you have a client and they've never had any type of positive outcome, or they've never heard a kind word, or they don't have a positive role model, this is the time to do that. This teaches them that, okay, even though you haven't had this in your life, who can we resource in? Who is someone you can imagine with you to support you? Or sometimes that looks like a fictional TV character. It could be from a book, a movie, a show. It could just be who do you wish you had, right? Sometimes we resource in animals. So it just gives that positive outcome. Like when they think that they're so alone in this world, or they've never had anyone kind or a positive experience, that's why resourcing is so important.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. And then the other phases, phase 3, target assessment. So this is where we are setting up the memory that we want to actually work with. This is really important because we are starting to integrate the left side of the brain and the right side. So we're bringing both hemispheres of the brain online, which is really helpful and useful in EMDR. So we're going to ask 7 questions. That's where I ask about the body scan, positive cognitions, right? This is where we also go over the negative cognition, which is kind of important because that's material that they've associated from the traumatic event. So we kind of want to eliminate that. That's part of the work, is getting rid of that negative cognition. So target assessment is really important. And then finally, we're ready to go into desensitization. So this is where we are actually targeting those memories. This is where we're actually using the bilateral stimulation, which could look like eye movements. It could look like tapping. Some people use buzzers or things in their ears. But this is where we're actively working on desensitizing the traumatic experience, where we're going to reprocess it, and then we're able to encode the memory where it actually belongs. So it's not so triggering. So it's not feeling like it's in the present. So that's kind of like where all the magic happens.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, we still have 5, which is installation. So this is where we take the positive cognition, we tie it to the negative part of the memory, and we enhance the positive cognition. So really, really powerful to just strengthen that.
Great.
And then we go into the body scan. So 6 is the body scan, and this is where we clear any disturbance in the body that is related to the target. Also why it works so well, because trauma gets stored in our bodies. So if we don't remember, it could also be implicit memories. The body scan will help get rid of all of that trauma that's stored in the body. And then we close out, we have closure at 7. And then this happens when we're ending any session. So this is when we want to ground our client back to the present. We want to tell them to take really good care of themselves. We want to let them know that they may continue to reprocess even when we're not together. But we don't want to bring up all of this stuff and then say, okay, session's over, like, have a great week, right? So we kind of just want to end the session in a positive way, make sure the client's okay to kind of go back to whatever they're doing. And then the last phase, reevaluation. And this is the assessment between sessions. So has anything come up for you? Anything changed? Anything that you noticed that I should know about? What are your symptoms like? And this is when we decide, okay, should we retarget a memory? Or is it a closed out memory and we feel good about this and we can move on to the next one?
Excellent.
So that's a rundown of all the 8 phases.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think it helps people prepare for the structure of EMDR and understanding that each of these phases has an intention, has a purpose, leading into the next phase, leading into a progression of success, right? Of that, success of moving forward for a client. So I love that. I think it's really great to hear the explanation and how it works. And it sounds really a very collaborative process where you're involved very closely with your client, and that they have that feedback, that information to give back to you as well. So that's great. I'm curious too. We've talked a little bit. I know that there's in the research, Stephen Porg's polyvagal theory is a popular theory. There has been some recent research that's come out that's not necessarily debunked it, but has, addressed it. It's still very relevant based on, the history of the research. I'm curious, EMDR relating to polyvagal theory, how do they relate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think about nervous system dysregulation, right, we talk about the sympathetic state, which could look like anxiety, that could look at that fight or flight, or we could look at dorsal, which shows up as depression, that immobilization of energy. So both of those states, those dysregulated states of the nervous system, definitely connect to EMDR, because the goal is to rewire and regulate the nervous system, right? The goal is to get back into that ventral state with more ease and not get stuck in one of those other states of where the trauma happened, right? We don't want to get stuck. So when we talk about unprocessed trauma that gets stored and trapped in the nervous system, I've heard some people describe this as when you're pressing on the gas and the brake at the same time, and there's all this leftover unprocessed energy from the trauma, well, that gets stored in our bodies. Yeah, so it relates to polyvagal theory in that we want to regulate our nervous system again, right? Not necessarily saying it's going to be calm all the time, but we want to be able to move with fluid kind of back into the ventral state. We don't want to get stuck in one of those survival states.
Yes. And to, I think it might be helpful for us to talk a little bit about what polyvagal theory is. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So polyvagal theory, we talk about the nervous system, the automatic nervous system, and we talk about the ladder. So we start at ventral, and that's where we feel safety, joy, connection, pleasure, right? That is where we can make positive, good, informed decisions. And that's kind of where we want to be. Obviously, like I said, we can't be in that 24/7, but the goal is to be able to kind of get back to that with more ease. When we're not in the ventral state, then we go down the ladder, and that looks like sympathetic. That looks like fight or flight. That looks like mobilization, right? That urgency. That's when we have all that urgency to do something, right? That I have to fight or I have to run. It could show up as hypervigilance. That looks like anxiety. And then as we go down the ladder even more, that looks like the dorsal state.
Mm-hmm.
That could look like immobilization. That could look like depression. The story we might tell ourselves in that state is why bother, right? That hopelessness feeling. So yeah, we kind of just move up and down this ladder, but the goal is to be able to get back into ventral state. Does that answer the question?
Excellent. Yes. No, that's a very good explanation. I'm glad you said that because the technicalities can get pretty out there. I like the way that you use a ladder, explain it as a step down and step up process because the brain is quite a remarkable machine, right? And it has a lot of phases and things that we need to understand how to regulate. And as you were speaking, I was thinking a little bit of Dr. Dan Siegel and his window of tolerance, explaining window of tolerance where, if we're putting it in that context, it's basically making sure that we can stay in a stable state and be able to have the resilience to cope with whatever memory, whatever trauma, whatever circumstance that is occurring. And that's really how it sounds like EMDR teaches this. It kind of gives that instruction. It sounds like based on what you're saying for clients to feel like they can do this independently once they've learned the process. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. So when we talk about that, it's basically that is another reason why EMDR works so well because we are doing it very slowly. That dual awareness, we want our client to have that dual awareness where they could think of the memory, right? But also not disassociate, stay attuned to actually engage in the BLS. The difference is when we do it, we're doing it slowly, right? We're slowly building capacity there to keep that dual awareness versus when the trauma happens, it just happens so fast and then we lose that. So the goal is to slowly build that, but keep the client in the window of tolerance.
Yes, absolutely. So basically on that note, how does a client know that EMDR is working?
Yeah, great question. So that could look like a lot of different things. That could look like a reduction in negative thoughts. So maybe they're thinking more positively, they have more positive cognitions than negative cognitions. That could look like more compassion for themselves, like self forgiveness, because sometimes the impact of trauma is a lot, and we have to forgive ourselves for the things that we did when we were in survival mode or when we didn't know any different. The memory is not so activating. So what I see a lot is the client will tell me, okay, it's like, well, we want to get the SUD. We call it a SUD. We want to get that to a 0 where it's not disturbing or neutral, right? So when they think about it, I have a lot of clients that say, oh, it looks really fuzzy, or what was the memory again? Like I don't even remember what we were working with. So it kind of like, yeah, it kind of just makes it not as activating. There's no hypervigilance around it. So they can live in the present and definitely decrease in symptoms. So they're able to get back into that ventral state, less depression, less anxiety.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm so excited that you have come on today to talk about this because, again, this is one of the treatment modalities that I think has been growing in, its research, its effectiveness, and yet it's still, I don't want to say newer because it's been around, but it's definitely more intricate in the treatment of various symptoms. And that's really important for people to know. So they have this awareness of what is this and how can it benefit me? So I think you've done a remarkable explanation. And I'm so grateful that you came on to tell us. Is there anything else you would want either clinicians to know or clients to know, potential clients even, about this modality?
Yeah, just that it's so widespread. You could use it for so many different things. So that's why I love it so much. It's also like kind of flexible, right? There's a script that comes along with it, but it's not that you have to stick exactly to the script, right? You can kind of use it as a guideline, which I love so much. Every client is different. All of our brains are different. What I really love about it, though, is that bottom up part and how it really helps us in ways that maybe cognitive behavioral therapy don't, or narrative therapy, right? Because when we talk about the somatics involved, there are parts of our brains that we don't reach where the trauma was through healing through CBT or modalities like that, or the narrative therapy that doesn't work all the time because we may not have words for what happened, right? That part of the brain, the Broca's area, it shuts down during a traumatic event. So we don't always have the words to write a narrative. And I think there are some researchers who have even said that it's very difficult for a person who's experienced trauma to put their narrative in a cohesive beginning, middle to end story of how it actually happened. So this is a great way that the client also doesn't necessarily have to be re-traumatized by sharing a trauma narrative, right? We hold the memory, and then as soon as they have the memory, the negative cognition and the body sensation, they start the BLS, and then they let go and allow whatever to come up. So a lot of clinicians would argue that it's less traumatizing, like we're not re-traumatizing the client. And the last reason I love this is because your brain is doing its own healing. And I think that is so beautiful, that is so powerful, that you are literally doing all the work. So when we think about how trauma really affects us and all these negative impacts, the best part is the healing. The best part is that neuroplasticity, the rewiring, right? Regulating the nervous system. Like, you are healing yourself. That is just so powerful. And it tells us that, healing's possible. We're not going to be stuck forever. One of the other reasons why I love using EMDR is because it also protects the clinician from vicarious trauma. And we're not listening to trauma stories all day long. So that could be helpful for the clinician as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. And it sounds like a wonderful way for clients, especially those who may have had a plateau in traditional CBT work or narrative work, that this may be a fantastic alternative and something that they can or even start with and see how it goes. But I love that it is a very broad intervention. These interventions are very broad, and it's not anything that's specified just for trauma. It can be for other conditions and symptoms as well. So this is great. Alexandra, I'm so happy that you came on today. I really appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and post. Do you have information that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. The name of my practice is Thrive in Life Therapy. Our website is www.thriveinlifesd.com. So if you're looking for EMDR therapy, or if you're just looking for a therapist, feel free to connect.
Wonderful. We'll go ahead and put that also in our, just right underneath in the podcast. So for information. So thank you again, Alexandra Brown. Thank you really for coming on. So happy that you were able to share this information, and looking forward to next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
The information and advice offered is not intended to treat or diagnose and is not meant to replace any other professional consultation. If you'd like to know more about the San Diego Psychological Association, go to our website at sdpsych.org. That's sdpsych.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care of yourself and be well.